Everyone, my name is Nicholas Hall, and I'm here in my role as Director of Arts and Humanities at the IAS. What a privilege it is to participate in a truly global event. It's my privilege this morning, or evening, or lunchtime, to introduce Professor Nicole Graham of the Law School at Sydney University. Nicole Graham is working with Nicholas Blomley, Chris Dalglish, Sandra Sham and Anna Stagno on the project Negotiating Landscapes of Rights, organised by Chris Gerard of Archaeology and Henry Jones of Law, which questions from many interdisciplinary points of view the interplay of memory, heritage, practice, and rights in determining the ownership and use of common land over thousands of years and numerous cultures and peoples. Professor Graham is indeed interdisciplinarity personified, researching in both property law and theory and legal geography. She made her name with a monograph, Lawscape, Property, Environment and Law, published by Routledge in 2011, which precisely relates property law to the environment and planetary sustainability. She's currently leading an ARC, Australian Research Council Discovery Project grant entitled Property as Habitat, Reintegrating People, Place and Law. His term at Durham, he's in particular been responsible for the project's fifth case study, which analyses the archaeological record as evidence that material processes of commoning are actually lawful and even legislative acts. Today, Professor Graham is going to tell us about progressive property theory as a principle of community law based on the Aristotelian notion of good living. In opposition to individual-orientated theory, it sets ownership in the context of a higher sustainable system or ecology, a network of ethical and other obligations going beyond our received, hallowed, anthropocentric concepts and practices. So to Professor Nicole Graham, Flourishing in the Anthropocene, Property, Community and Climate.
Hi everyone, thank you for arriving early in UK time for my lecture. I'd like to first of all thank Durham University and the Institute of Advanced Studies, and especially to Veronica Strang and Henry Jones and Chris Gerard and the fantastic members of the Landscapes of Rights research collaboration. So the presentation that I'm giving today is called Flourishing in the Anthropocene, Property, Community and Climate Change. This paper, this lecture is connected to Landscapes of Rights and that project in the sense that this is about property at the macro level and about the consequences of rights and rights to land, rights in property. And it touches on some very old and ancient themes, the idea of flourishing, and it connects it to contemporary questions about climate change and the Anthropocene. So property regimes control access to and distribution of real and abstract things, both within and beyond a society. They raise fundamental questions about power, economy, ethics and ecology, the answers to which are informed by ideas of what law is and the place of humans in the world. For millennia, Western theories of property have been dominated by anthropocenic ideas of law, land and the environment. By the 20th century, though, property theories had come to be articulated predominantly in terms of abstract rights held by autonomous individuals, which conceptualized human society and the non-human world in very atomistic terms as separate, disaggregated units. And that model of property isolates and insulates property interests from the network of relations and obligations that arise from the sociality of organised human society. In the 21st century, against these views of property in society, legal scholars around the world have been questioning that model, and American legal scholars have advanced what they call a progressive property theory. Progressive property theory offers a significant departure from the orthodox abstractness of the dominant property theory and is a corrective to its atomism. So central to this new American theory, progressive property theory, is the notion of community. Community as the basis of property relations and as the limitation of property relations. And from this view, the individual does not stand prior to the community or ontologically prior to the community. Indeed, autonomy is only possible through community relationships. So it is through this emphasis on relationality that the progressivists maintain that systems of property are always the creation of some community. And they thus position property as the hinge in community life, through which individuals are bonded together. Consequently, they argue, proprietors are obliged to support the communities that enable them to flourish. They argue, quote, the human flourishing theory grounds obligations on dependence on others to provide them in various ways with the means necessary to enable the development of certain indispensable capabilities, for which both virtues and material resources are required. Now, this is a version of the social obligation norm that underpins progressive property theory, and it also stretches back to Aristotle and his ethics of eudemonia, which is translated today as human flourishing or as living well. Now, Aristotle was writing in the 4th century BC, but of course, property is not timeless, and the world has since changed. Recently, as many of us know, over 11,000 scientists from 153 countries declared that planet Earth is facing a climate emergency that will result and already is resulting in untold suffering and loss of life. That statement was made in 2019. The rise of global greenhouse gas emissions above pre-industrial levels is rapidly transforming the climate of the planet, presenting an existential crisis on a scale far greater than the individual, society, or species, and scientists have called this the Anthropocene. Since 4 of 9 planetary boundaries related to critical Earth system processes are currently transgressed, some hard questions about human well-being in the 21st century arise. The conditions of living well, defined by developed world standards of affluence, are by far the strongest determinant and the strongest accelerator of these planetary transgressions. Critical analyses by First Nations, scientists, social scientists, humanities and legal scholars implicate Western legal doctrines and economic models, including especially property and its regulation of the goods of life in creating the conditions of climate change. If organised human societies are to survive, let alone to flourish, in the Anthropocene, they will need to correct these conditions through bold and drastic transformations. My lecture considers the transformative potential of progressive property theory to provide a viable model of human-Earth relations for the 21st century by asking it 2 questions. First, what does flourishing or living well mean in an era of climate change? Anthropogenic environmental change is diminishing the capacity of the Earth's ecosystems to support human well-being. But the situation is more complex than it first appears, since countries with higher levels of life satisfaction and healthy life expectancy tend to transgress more biophysical boundaries. This makes it difficult to reconcile a theory of property that prioritises living well with declining planetary health. And this raises my second question: can the concept of community that underpins the progressive property model be extended to include people living in property's shadow places of the global south and also the more than human world. This is important. These questions are important to consider since the benefits and the costs of climate change are unequally distributed. Is the realisation of progressive property theory possible only through the social and environmental displacement of its costs onto distant and not so distant others? I argue that living well or flourishing in the Anthropocene must entail a radical overhaul of the dominant model of property because of its central function in the global economy and its evident and profound contribution to the existential threat posed by climate change. If progressive property is a truly material and relational model of people-environmental relations, as it claims to be, then the material conditions and indicators of living well need to be directly and urgently included in its architecture. The arrival of the Anthropocene calls for a planetary understanding of community that encompasses the disowned human and more than human members of the global south, whose work in capital's shadowlands provides the very conditions of modern Western proprietorship. Living well, let alone at all, throughout the 21st century will involve reframing social obligation more broadly as existential imperative in modelling a viable property regime. First Nations analysts have long foreshadowed that the reproduction of the dominant legal regime will ensure the decline of all life on Earth, and that decline is well advanced. The first 3 months of the year 2020 were the warmest or the second warmest global average surface temperatures on record. April 2020 was tied as the warmest April on record with April 2016, which was the hottest year on record. 2015 to 2019 are the 5 warmest years on record. The major driver of higher global temperatures is greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. In 2018, the annual increases of the main greenhouse gases were all larger than in the previous year and many times greater than at pre-industrial levels. At current levels of emissions, the world is on course to exceed the agreed temperature thresholds of 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Worse still is the risk that such an increase could be locked in without immediate decarbonisation, because it takes centuries to millennia for carbon dioxide already present in the atmosphere to be removed by natural processes. Carbon lock-in generally constrains technological, economic, political and social efforts to reduce carbon emissions. There are innumerable consequences of climate change and I cannot list them all. Some are ocean acidification, sea level rise, record-breaking tropical cyclones, droughts, bushfire activities, food insecurity, decreased water quality, biodiversity decline and human population displacement. The list goes on. These facts are regarded collectively as indicators of what scientists describe as the Anthropocene, which they understand to be the beginning of a very rapid human-driven trajectory of the Earth system away from the glacial interglacial limit cycle toward new, hotter climatic conditions and a profoundly different biosphere. Scientists created the concept of the Anthropocene to describe human impacts on the Earth's surface of such magnitude, scope and scale as to present an existential threat. Scientific literature also engages the collateral concept of planetary boundaries in its dissemination of models of feedback processes and tipping points that accompany and compound the severity and duration of the above observations through their cumulative effects on the Earth's system's thresholds. The overarching recommendation from physical scientists is that greenhouse gas emissions reductions must start immediately, since the burden of delay is amplified by the lock-in of existing sources and technologies. Now, the narratives that accompany the scientific advent of the Anthropocene are significant, analytically speaking, to the development of viable solutions. One aspect of the narrative of the Anthropocene is its departure from the characteristic conventions of Western scientific discourse, its detached objectivity and disconnection from the life that it has poisoned, tortured, dissected, preserved, destroyed, and atomized into finite taxonomies of knowable things and phenomena. Scientists are frustrated by political inertia, and they are changing their audience and their discourse. They are translating complex technical data into accessible information using the narratives of emergency and crisis, with emphases on system connectivities and catastrophic domino effects. The discursive shift from objective detachment to dire warnings corresponds with the unprecedented scale and impact of harms that the data is recording and predicting. Another important aspect of the scientific narrative of the Anthropocene is its homogenization of multiple, diverse human societies into a singular and strikingly northern anthropos. Social scientists and humanities scholars have critiqued the blunt attribution of climate change agency to the human species as a whole, because it fails to observe the agency of the operation of a specific economic system promoted by a global minority. Social scientists and humanities scholars argue that the Anthropocene narrative overlooks global inequalities that are paramount to understanding the underlying causes and consequences of climate change. Critical analyses of the scientific narrative of the Anthropocene and climate change have proven useful to developing greater accuracy in our understanding of its causes and thus potential solutions. Viewing the Anthropocene as the consequence of a highly particular and relatively recent economic model and attendant legal regime, rather than as an inherently human condition, facilitates measures that are targeted for maximum mitigatory effect. The critical analysis and synthesis of trade, GDP, and emissions data point to the correspondence of northern affluence through appropriation of labour and land, and its corollary displacement of work and environmental loads with climate change. This is increasingly recognised by climate scientists. The most affluent countries are mainly responsible for the historical greenhouse gas emissions and generally have the greatest per capita emissions. Unless appropriation and displacement are better understood as agents of climate change, it will remain unlikely that effective solutions can be found. Critical analyses of both climate change data and anthropocenic narratives reveal that there are no solutions available by reproducing the economic models and legal doctrines born in colonial Britain. We need to think and learn about the world differently. In particular, there is an urgency for the world's affluent population living in nice places to open their eyes wide and to see and know law beyond the colonialist foundation that framed the natural world as property that is divided up for sale, profit, and exploitation. But where to begin? Questions of episteme, techne, and phronesis arise simultaneously, says Castries. Consequently, climate change calls on academics to rise above our disciplinary prejudices, for it is a crisis of many dimensions. It requires a joined-up analysis of the highest order, both within and between the environmental and social sciences. Social sciences and humanities research have already started to engage scientific research data as an input and have worked to connect it to relevant analyses of economies, laws, financial systems, political systems, social systems, histories, and cultures. And all of this work helps to identify and correct some of the socio-economic errors that are apparent in the early scientific narrative that attached to Anthropocenic data. And this leads to more accurate and focused understandings of the precise locus of the problem, so that effective solutions might become possible. There is a role to play for every discipline, and this is true especially for law. Legal scholars have researched the relationship of law to climate change regarding a range of legal inputs and effects, and have contributed critical analyses of the Anthropocene in discursive and jurisprudential terms. Consistent with research findings from the social sciences and humanities, legal scholars have also identified climate change as sociogenic rather than anthropogenic, in that there is a direct relationship between particular regulatory frameworks, legal practices, and patterns of adverse environmental change. English legal scholar Anna Greer argues that patterned and predictable global and globalizing distributions of intraspecies and interspecies injustice are so foundational to the Anthropocene Capitalocene that the current ecological crisis cannot really be understood without them, end quote. Accountability and suffering in the Anthropocene are distributed unequally across the categories of nation, culture, class, race, gender, and generation, in part because of the developmentalist logic built into legal positivism and the rule of law. Legal research identifies the institutionalized and legally protected entitlement to and accumulation and disposal of cheap nature, to quote Moore, at the scale of the global, established by European and British imperial powers in their colonisation of other places and peoples in the world as the leading agent of climate change. Legal analyses of the Anthropocene are consistent with many First Nations analyses of the adverse impact of European and British colonisation and legal institutions on the landscapes and countries from which diverse Indigenous legal regimes derive. Climate change is the result of a legacy of colonialism, slavery, and extraction, says Beth Gardner. The holistic ontologies of First Nations laws highlight and confound the anthropocentric logic of cheap nature through which Western laws construct regimes of dispossession, as Levian says. As the Canadian First Nations legal scholar John Burrows has argued, North American environmental and democratic systems are straining to sustain their current level of economic activity and material consumption, and the viability of statements requires that our ideologies and decision-making structures take account of the fact that we are embedded in nature, end quote. First Nations laws are largely place-based. What that means is that they are particular to specific and dynamic geographical conditions and limits. They are not universal, they are not abstract. There is no pan-Indigenous legal regime, to be sure, but many place-based Indigenous laws clearly foreground the authority, the contingency, and the presence of non-human life and the interdependence of all life and the situation of life in the dynamism of time. Place-based laws are at odds with legal regimes that facilitate economic models of infinite growth and global development. Santos has argued that achieving a good life or flourishing requires an epistemological shift away from the anthropocentric ontologies of the laws of the global north and an engagement with the numerous and diverse alternatives of the global south. Many contemporary Anglo-European legal concepts and doctrines, indeed the taxonomy of law itself, developed precisely to protect and to defend the socio-economic institutions that facilitated the conditions of the Anthropocene. The rise of industrialisation and a growth-based economy with its attendant political and economic philosophies of liberalism and capitalism. Now, central to the taxonomy of modern Western law is the public-private dichotomy, by which it regulates the distribution and entitlement to the things of life into separate spheres. There are things for everyone, and there are things for individuals, public and private. This distinction between public and private is regarded as a keystone of the semantic architecture of Western law, and it is important to note it is ordered hierarchically. Legal historian Dan Priel contends that the origins of this separation of public and private law in the development of English law were manufactured to shield private interests from the pursuit of collective goals in liberal democracies. Historical accounts of the development of this private-public taxonomy are consistent with analyses of the current overarching regulatory framework of regulatory capitalism, through which markets themselves have now become important national, regional, and global regulators that protect private interests from public interests such as taxation and industrial relations. And as many of us know, the largest economies in the world today are not those of nation states, but of private corporations. The private sphere is thus the locus of the vast majority of the goods of life, and the legal rights to those goods are concentrated largely through the key institution of private property. Notwithstanding variations of legal culture across jurisdictions that support capital economies, the legal forms of private property and the corporation commonly underpin their function, socio-material relations, and discourses of entitlement. As Carol Rose has argued, private property and freedom of contract are the basic building blocks of capitalism. The relative simplicity of modern property rights makes them tradable to a worldwide pool of bidders, and this feature in turn means that goods and services can circulate all over the globe. These dominant and ubiquitous legal forms are abstract, but their material manifestation is well recognised as facilitating global environmental harms. As Sally Wheeler has said, there are virtually always environmental effects that exacerbate climate change involved in most corporate activity. One explanation for the failure of law's key institutions is precisely their abstractness. They're simply not conceptualised or situated within any geographical or metabolic relations and limits. The structure of the corporate form, says Wheeler, in terms of its purpose and its relationships, is incompatible with the world's fragile environmental ecosystem. It is clear from First Nations analyses, climate science metrics, social science scholarship, and legal research that the interaction of Western private law, particularly property, and the Earth's laws adversely impact on the Earth's systems. So the jury is in. Law is a contingent feature of planetary health. Property is both an agent and an obstacle to flourishing. It has lifted up some while pushed down many. The reason that property is not capable of facilitating flourishing, in my opinion, is because it is far too removed from its material conditions and limits. Property is based on a model of dephysicalising persons and things into individual rights holders and individual rights. Through enclosure and colonisation, the model of dephysicalised property facilitated the transition from feudal land law, when land was not freely disposable, to the capitalist property law, when land was an infinitely tradable commodity. Enclosure and colonisation were sustained periods of violent land taking and resistance through political and military power. The moral rationale to dispossess people of their own lands and to change long-established legal relations between people and places relied heavily on an idea of improvement, of improving both those foreign lands and improving those foreign peoples. The goal of improvement discourse was the cultivation of wastelands, or what was regarded as wastelands, into commercially productive landscapes and the progress of human society itself. As Paul Langford, a legal historian, wrote, improvement was the favourite word of the 1760s and the 1770s. It carried with it a great mass of material aspirations and moral assumptions. In nothing is this seen more clearly than in the immense resources devoted to the exploitation of the most basic of national assets, the land. The project of British colonisation corresponded with a newly formulated moral order and social structure. The new model facilitated the alienability of land and the alienation of peoples from their traditional lands by scaling the human side of the model down from a landed nation or a landed community or even just a landed family to the unit of an individual person in isolation from their social network, whose claim to land was theoretically based on their capacity to convert that land into commercially valuable resources. In simple terms, the initial post-feudal model of property was a person-thing relation in which an individual person improved land into a commodifiable thing, and that this warranted their proprietorship. As a practice, dephysicalized property dispossessed and displaced human communities and nations. It was rationalized variously in legal terms, for example, through the terra nullius doctrine. And this dephysicalized property doctrine that does operate today, predominates today, could not exist without a sustained history of actually physically removing people from the places in which they had lived for centuries and millennia all over the world. This dislocation of entire communities and nations undermined their associated legal regimes that derived from and regulated complex people-place relations in particular lands and waters, and they could not be transplanted elsewhere. Without place-based knowledges manifest in the laws of those displaced local communities, and without the observance of local laws by those communities, entire landscapes were misread, neglected, and damaged by newcomers with poor knowledge and little interest in learning about local material conditions and limits. Dephysicalized property by design is potentially applicable to any valuable right, so that it can facilitate the exchange of capital in whatever form it may take now and into the future. And there are numerous examples of this in relation to solid, liquid, and gaseous parts of the landscape being separated out and extracted and removed to resource markets, and in relation to the trading of water and the separation of title to water from title to land, and in relation to another example, the concept of the biodiversity offset or biobanking or habitat compensation. These concepts again transform things that are networked and relational into detachable commodities. So I guess the takeaway point here about property is that it is implicated in the Anthropocene and in climate change. It's been instrumental to the dispossession of human and non-human communities. It has been instrumental to this disentanglement of integrated ecologies into separate natural resources and ecoservices. And the model frames property relations as entirely between persons and humans. So it's a set of intra-human rights rather than relationships between humans and material things in the human's habitat. So to quote Raymond Williams, if we alienate the living processes of which we are a part, we end, although unequally, by alienating ourselves. So I'll leave that discussion of property there, and I will move now to a discussion of shadow ecologies. So in 1991, Jim McNeill, Peter Vincemius, and Taizo Yakashuji published Beyond Independence, The Meshing of the World's Economy and the Earth's Ecology. And in this book, they describe shadow ecologies, the shadow ecologies of states that extend well beyond their borders. Shadow ecologies are the unseen and often undervalued dimensions of the ecology of a country or community or city. Now, their analysis of people-place relations was on an international scale, and they present this as an example of ecological displacement, whereby environmental costs and harms are evaded through transferring them to other places, for example, through the waste trade, or, for example, postponing them to a future time, for example, species extinction and atmospheric pollution, so trading in biodiversity and trading in pollution. At any scale, ecological displacement is facilitated and legitimated by a particular paradigm of law and justice. It exploits the invisibility of shadow ecologies because it involves discounting the lives of those who live in those resource supply areas or who find themselves on the receiving end of that industrial waste stream, or who are the generations yet to be born. The paradigm of law and justice that supports ecological displacement is dematerialized. It frames abstract rights between persons who are alienated from and beyond responsibility for the physical conditions and consequences of the exercise of their own rights. Now, informed by this line of scholarship, an Australian feminist philosopher, Val Plumwood, developed her notion of a world split between nice north places, as she calls them. And nice north places are the places that we want to live in, but that leave shadow places that are not so nice. And the other part of this split world is the shadow places. And whilst the nice places are where the fruits of labour are enjoyed, the shadow places are where the labour takes place and where the waste is generated for and from the nice places. So shadow places are the disowned externalities of the nice places. Plumwood argues from a justice perspective that this is morally wrong and ecologically inviable. And she says that we should be able to recognise the shadow places by making them visible so that we can see that they are the necessary correlates of the nice places. But it is hard to see and acknowledge shadow places since they have been removed from the dominant model of property. The dominant model of property is abstract. It is between persons. It conceals these material conditions. It causes us to have a false consciousness that justifies our appropriation. But if we can make our ecological relationships visible and accountable, then it would be harder for us to disown them. The proper objects of ownership, Plumwood contends, are the conditions and consequences of property rights in nice places, the sacrificial shadow places. She says, and I quote, "The places that take our pollution and dangerous waste, exhaust their fertility, or destroy their indigenous or non-human populations in producing our food. And we must own these places too." Towards this goal, a lesson from the Indigenous model, to take a quote from Plumwood, she encourages us to consider a form of land ownership in which the economic rights of production and consumption that arise from that parcel of land are aligned with the moral responsibilities of care for the same parcel of land. Plumwood's concept of shadow places pulls us to concrete localities. It includes the experiences of people in those places. It has a strong moral dimension, says Cameron Muir, and it goes to the heart of justice in the Anthropocene. The simplicity of the dephysicalized model of property masks the dynamic and relational nature of landscapes and pretends human independence from them. This model encourages the displacement and disownership of its risks and costs to its correlate shadow lands. The latest contribution to such scholarship is the contribution of climate science, which tells us that even if modern land law was successfully reformed to position people as the mere tenants of the soil, the lease is very short, says Barbara Harris-White. While dephysicalized property foregrounds the agency of an active individual person, Barbara Harris-White reminds us of the agency of materiality in the very possibility of human life. She says, "The present human population may survive on this planet only as long as it allows them to." And this is where I come to the Americans and the progressive property theory. Progressive property theory is a notion obviously based on progress. And it's interesting to ask, how is progress related to the notion of improvement from the 1700s? Is it forward-looking? Is it unable to look backwards? Ezra Rosser argues we should not preclude attention to the historical conditions of our status quo. We need to have an eye on the stolen lands, on the slavery, and on colonisation. Progressive property theory fundamentally sees the community as the basis and the limit of private property. Legal scholars who have paid attention to the pervasive and pathological effects of property on the environment do draw a causal link between the cumulative impact of property's preference for consumptive users over the preservation, conservation, or maintenance of natural resources. If it were otherwise, says Carol Rose, we would be unlikely to have evidence of so many decimations of valuable fish and wildlife, desertified former forests and grasslands, polluted water bodies, or murderously filthy air. And so I guess my questions are in relation to scale. Who is living well in a community that flourishes? Where does the community stop? Progressive property theorists reject the model of community as a collection of autonomous individuals on which the dominant theory of property is based, and they advance instead a conception of community defined by relationality. By community, the progressivists refer principally to human communities and also in certain political contexts. But it is not actually necessary to the logic of this theory to so restrict the concept of community. In the context of climate change, it would be helpful to conceptualize community more broadly, to acknowledge and to integrate human dependencies and responsibilities on and for people and non-human life. How community is defined matters to the progressive model of property because it is ontologically premised on a relational rather than on an atomistic notion of being. And while dominant accounts of property hinge on notions of human exceptionalism, independence, and individual human freedoms, the progressive property account, by contrast, hinges on the ties that bind us. Accordingly, to define community in terms other than global at this point in time pretends a material independence from bonds that are created through global supply and production chains, without which the whole idea of living well in the Western sense would not be possible. Apparent improvements in resource productivity, as well as environmental and working conditions in developed countries, are often dominated by displacements to other countries rather than solely achieved domestically. Upscaling our frame of analysis is thus critical in any effort to correct the dominant individualistic model of property. A resource allocation system that allows users to ignore significant scales of use eventually will self-destruct. Embedding property within community, as progressive property theorists advocate, is ethically and materially preferable to the atomism of the dominant model. Living well not only ethically obliges, but also materially bonds that community to the producers of its resources and the recipients of its waste. A model of property that embodied rather than externalized resources would necessarily redefine community to include the lives of those who live in resource supply areas or who find themselves on the receiving end of the industrial waste stream. And so to conclude, progressive property theory presents one corrective to atomistic theories that isolate property interests from the network of relations that arise from the sociality of organised human society. The social obligation norm that underpins this theory hails from Aristotle's philosophy of eudemonia of the 4th century. But rising greenhouse gas emissions and above pre-industrial levels is transforming our planet's climate, presenting an existential crisis on a scale greater than the individual or the community. For millennia, Western theories of property have been dominated by anthropocentric notions of law and land. However, the concept of community central to progressive property theory foregrounds materiality and relationality, potentially engendering a different model of human-earth relations for this 21st century. Flourishing in the Anthropocene will require planetary understandings of property's community to urgently reframe the social obligation norm as an existential imperative. And so if we are going to support progressive property theory, then we need to include in this the material indicators of living well, not just social indicators. We need to look at water and land footprints. We need to ask, what is the footprint of flourishing that we can ethically justify? And I will leave it there on that question, and I look forward to a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was an exemplary display of what interdisciplinarity can bring, bringing together the two strengths of individual disciplines and producing something which was bigger than the mix of both of them. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. There is already one question in the chat, and I'll read that for the benefit of the people watching by the recording. So Rob Barton says, what's the solution? Appealing to principles of justice might do little to allay one's pessimism, since humans have a sorry history in terms of putting aside short-term self-interest for the good of others or for long-term common good. Green policies only tinker at the edges, making us in the comfortable north sleep more easily by avoiding a realistic assessment of ecological catastrophes to come and the huge changes we would have to make to avoid them. How can one convince the haves to take on progressive property theory to the extent it will have significant effects? Thank you very much, Rob, for engaging with these ideas and problems, if that's not putting it too lightly. So the first thing I would say is that I don't share the view that at a species level, humans have a sorry history in terms of putting aside short-term self-interest for the good of others or for long-term common good. So, and I might be a little bit influenced by Jared Diamond here of Guns, Germs and Steel, but I think that, I mean, I chose a career in the education sector because I fundamentally believe in the power of learning to modify our behaviours and the way that we think about ourselves and the world and others. And I have learned living in Australia that non-European Australians who have been here for millennia have succeeded in developing multiple viable property regimes. And how do we know they're successful? Well, because they lasted for a very long time, for one, and they lasted without sort of cannibalizing all of the things within their own habitat, which isn't to say that there weren't enormous ecological mistakes. And so Tim Flannery's work and the work of many other scientists from around the world have shown that it takes time for organised human societies to learn what their habitat is, to understand that they can't soil their own environments and that they need to adapt to live in them successfully and viably. And so what I think is that the property regime that we have now is really young, it's very immature. So the property system that dominates in Anglo-Australia today is less than 500 years old. It's closer to about 300. So in the scheme of human history, that's a tiny amount of time. And already in 300 years in Australia, it's very clear that that property regime is very maladapted to this particular set of habitats and landscapes. And so there's a desire and an effort to try to modify that regime. So I think humans are intelligent and they are capable of learning from mistakes. I guess your question is pointing to the political end of the spectrum, which is how do you overcome the scale of political self-interest? And I don't disagree that there are a lot of less intelligent, more sort of shorter scale humans pulling the levers of a lot of economic decision making. But I guess, Rob, I have to say that if we give up, then we're fundamentally turning our backs as educators on the possibility of education and on learning. So I would say that, and in relation to the other part about tinkering at the edges, yes, I think that you could argue that. I don't disagree with that. And I think that, yes, we do try to sleep better by pretending that we can't see things. The thing is, in Australia and in other parts of the world, it isn't, those shadow places, they're not necessarily invisible. So you can actually see them physically with your own eyes. And, you know, the fish kills in Australia, drought, the fact that the Sydney, which is the biggest city in the country's drinking water supply, was critically at risk at the end of a drought, means that there's a consciousness about our consumption and our waste and our relationship to the land here that perhaps isn't encountered in all parts of the world. But I do think that there are developed economies that are fundamentally exposed to the risks of their own behaviours and property regime. I don't know that that answers your question, and I do share your cynicism regularly, but I can't give up because I'm not really ready to be a real estate agent just yet.
We've says he feels better. Thanks for that, Nico. We've got a couple of minutes left. I've got a, there's no other question. I've got a kind of a footnote to Rob's excellent question. Nicole, for me, in a good way, your talk was back to the future. And what I mean by that is it took me back, without being too confessional, to my romantic and anarchist past as a student in an earlier decade, a late decade of the last millennium. I remember there's a famous German romantic who said, nature is the enemy of eternal possessions. I'm thinking of Proudhon, la propriété c'est du vol. Property is theft. Of course, not to mention Marx, my later anarchism. My question is this, now I'm not sure how legally literate this is. What is the agent of the community? Is it back to the state?
I guess that's a scale question, Nicholas, and this is what the Americans have to explain to us. So a little bit of the context, the American theory comes out of Cornell University, generally, very broadly speaking, and what it's critiquing and against is coming out of the Chicago School. And so the Chicago School doesn't see the community at all. It thinks it's a romantic notion of, or an abstract notion that you imagine yourself to be part of a community. But they have a more cynical view and think, well, what is your community? Your golf club, your church, your family, all the people that wear the same Prada outfits as you. Whereas the Cornell group haven't actually defined community. They've left that deliberately open, and some of the leading scholars in progressive property have said, oh, you could be a community of this, or it could be a community of that. And that's a problem because the reason that you identify is who is the agent of the community. Well, I guess that depends on who the community is, but also the scale of that community. Now, very clearly in my argument, I'm saying the idea of a community as opposed to the idea of an individual is probably the better approach to take. But what I'm saying is that we need to expand whatever idea of community we might have, because some kind of localized community in a global economy is a nonsense, in my opinion, in my respectful opinion, I hasten to add. So I guess I'm situating property within its broader economic context, and that is why some kind of local scale has to be connected in some way to the animals and sort of other biotic resources that we are fundamentally dependent on for our well-being and flourishing. The agent, who can say? I guess that goes to the desire of that community to live and to sustain itself, and agency would be expressed through the strongest manifestation of that desire.
There's one, thank you for that. Notice our audience are staying with us, and I'm not surprised. Let's give it just another couple of minutes. There's one more question from Veronica, Veronica Strang. Would you care to read it out?
Thank you, yes. Thanks, Veronica. As she said, Veronica says, as you've noted, one of the key issues is the control of virtual and material global markets by transnational corporations that are disembedded, abstracted from national and local and material contexts, and almost wholly unaccountable and difficult to regulate. What kinds of changes in international property law could hold them to account and achieve the responsibility for material and social effects that they currently ignore? Thank you, Veronica. My colleague Sally Wheeler, who's now the Dean of Law at the Australian National University in Canberra, which is the capital of Australia, writes about this, and she writes about corporations law. And I guess corporations law is some kind of version of international property law. Veronica. The changes that will be involved in accountability would be very much in the corporations law, property law space. And unfortunately, the reason that there are none at the moment is because environmental law or climate law works as a separate body or sub-discipline of law in a different part of the taxonomy, and isn't really successful in chipping away at the fundamental priority of property law in law's taxonomy. And I guess that's why I'm targeting property law to reform itself. Well, not reform itself, for us to reform this model, because external regulation of corporations isn't successful. How would you go about doing that? I guess you'll be aware in your country, as in ours, that we have a registration system of property. And registration nearly always is a registration of rights associated with property, but there's no logical prohibition on also registering responsibilities that could be audited because they're on a register. So there are little ideas. I mean, there are a lot of people working at this at a very sort of small and local level all over the world. And I guess if there was actually a resourcing and putting together of those smaller ideas into a bigger picture, that would help. But of course, it's very hard to get a grant from Google when you're trying to make Google accountable for something. But anyway, that's a cynical comment. Rob would totally relate to that, I'm sure. Thank you, Veronica. I'm sure I have not answered your question adequately.
Just one last one, if I may, and thank you to the audience for staying with us. It's a compliment to Nicole. One last one from my former colleague, the Institute of Hazard, Risk and Resilience, Lena Dominelli. Can you see that, Nicole?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Nicholas. Lena, thank you for your question, which is, can you say something about how Aboriginal and Indigenous and First Nations peoples can be empowered so that their ideas gain more acceptability and spread? I guess the most important thing, Lena, is to invite First Nations scholars and leaders and youth to participate in the decision-making process. There are lots of very sensitive and controversial practices in relation to decision-making in jurisdictions where there are also Indigenous and Aboriginal First Nations perspectives and laws involved. And we are, I would say, at a turning point. I think it'll be premature to say we have turned a corner, but we are at a turning point where it's recognised that Indigenous and First Nations peoples must be at the table of decision making as opposed to represented or paraphrased or romanticised. So I guess inclusion at a policy level of decision making is essential. Thank you, Lena.
I'm afraid we're going to have to break off now. There happen to be no other questions. Of course, it's possible to contact Nicole through her IAS Durham email. Just a couple of things from me. Thanks to Nicole again for decentering our perspective so effectively. Thanks to Ronan O'Donnell for keeping an eye on the technology. And just one last advertisement, if I may. Our last event of this term, the IAS, is a seminar by another member of this excellent project, if I may say, Anastaño. And it's another one which is going to interest me, I have to say, deurbanizing rural spaces, the words we use and the interpretation of the past. And that's 8 a.m. GMT. I'll just repeat that. It's another global event. 8 a.m. GMT on Monday, the 15th of March, through the usual Zoom link available at the IAS. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.